completed.
Hey everyone, today I'm going to be talking about the Close Combat series, specifically the first trilogy. I believe Close Combat is one of the most innovative RTS games we've ever seen. This video mostly talks about the game's place in the context of its own genre, and particularly in the 90s. But before we begin, I gotta go get the CDs out of my attic. I'll just be a moment, just 1 second. The idea for Close Combat emerged from a relationship between the PC gaming development company, Atomic Games, and the vaunted board game producer Avalon Hill. The duo spent the early 90s releasing the V for Victory series, as well as the critically acclaimed World at War Stalingrad. But as computer technology improved, war games became overshadowed by the growing real-time strategy genre. The gaming marketplace had become more about graphical glitz and less about statistical glamour. Many wargame enthusiasts argue that the slow, methodical pace of a turn-based game realistically reflects the ponderous nature of operational warfare, because in the field, so to speak, strategic orders were planned over long periods of time, and were just as slowly executed more often than not. Unfortunately for the layman, this is boring and too similar to old people games like chess or even croquet, which is why Nintendo came up with Battle Chess and Battle Croquet. The question developers started to ask was, who really wants to be like Ike? Old, bald, pushing, faceless army divisions across maps. Kids don't. Kids are the people who play games. Kids want to be heroes. They want to be Audie Murphy, manning the 50 caliber machine gun, cutting Germans in half, winning the Medal of Honor, introducing the world of PTSD. This new focus on action is why the 90s games market centered on three things: the Wizard, Chex Quest, and copying Dune 2 as often as possible. Given these changes in the games market, Atomic Games and Avalon Hill saw an opportunity to transfer their wargaming knowledge into a more focused squad-based game, something that would satisfy the grognards, while at the same time taking advantage of technology's newest bells and whistles to reel in the more casual gamers. Sadly, this evolving games market had a really strong impact on Avalon Hill, who by the mid-90s had come down with a bad case of bronchitis. Atomic Games, threatened with no longer being paid, hit the streets as a free agent, where it was quickly picked up by Microsoft Studios. By this time, Microsoft had been showing interest in the gaming scene for a while, which made sense, given that the growing bulk of the scene was being made to run on their hardware. Clothed in a half-developed Close Combat, Atomic Games was hard for Microsoft to ignore. They immediately dumped their resources into the game, and it was released for PC on June 30th, 1996. It received rave reviews praising its presentation and gameplay. It sold over 200,000 copies, which, accounting for inflation, literally made them a gazillion dollars. So why the warm reception? When Close Combat was released, the market for strategy games had become flooded with very basic gameplay: collect resources, build units, battle enemies. Are you an orc and a human? Well, collect resources, build units, and battle identical factions. What if you're in some kind of brotherhood for secret man codes, like nodding? Well, just change the terminology a bit and you're good to go. Harvest resources, manufacture units, and battle toads. The genre had become so stale that even the basic addition of units giving quips when clicked on was worthy of praise. But ultimately, all the units across the entire RTS spectrum were about as emotionally real as a stick. As an RTS fan, I began to feel like a woman cold-shouldered by her man. Alone, unloved, barren, my every thought clouded by a desire to drown children in bathtubs. I don't mean to put down any of these games, even though that's exactly what I've done. I'm just trying to illustrate that the RTS genre was becoming increasingly bloated during the 90s. The games changed venues, from settings past and future, but the concerts were all the same. Even today, the RTS is still treading water. The genre was just incredibly stale by the time Close Combat hit the stores. But Close Combat did not just stand out because it was different. The original trilogy did have a lot of novelty to it, but these were very good games in their own right. Atomic Games sought to integrate three primary factors into its new franchise: the human factor, realism, and dynamic gameplay. The human factor really was Close Combat's biggest selling point. It's even on the cover of the box. Take command of men who act like real soldiers, a tagline right below a picture of a wide-eyed GI who'd rather be anywhere else than in front of an exploding tank. Close combat's human factor is also probably the first thing a new player notices in-game. Every trooper has a name, as well as a state of health, mind, and body. Aside from getting hurt or killed, soldiers can break under the stress of combat. They can cower, flee, or in some cases go insane and bonsai charge the enemy. Soldiers are also susceptible to wearing down. Humping across a field of weapons and equipment is tiring work. Exhausted soldiers are little of use, forcing players to smartly bound short distances. Unit morale and fighting effectiveness became the game's hidden but primary resources. In other RTS games, you focus fire a unit to kill it faster. In close combat, you might focus fire a unit to break its morale and open a hole in your enemy's lines. These concepts were a huge break from the mindless footmen of basically every other RTS game on the market. In close combat, soldiers do many things without your say-so, as each man has a sense of self-preservation. They don't give a shit if you want to take the hill that's guarded by a tank. A squad disobeying orders was the game's way of telling you that you weren't doing a good job. The game's realism is what guides the player along. Weapons in close combat are used in a manner that is lifelike and obvious. You cannot take a squad of riflemen and shoot a tank to bits, for example. Mortars cannot track moving targets with godlike precision. A bazooka is not going to penetrate the front of a tiger. These elements are what give close combat a sense of asymmetrical balance. Just like in real life, American squads have a lot of firepower. M1 Garands, Bars, Thompsons. But just like real life, the Germans have superior armor. And by pursuing this realism, close combat manages to create very different factions. These two elements put together, the human factor and realism, leads to very dynamic gameplay. Because our soldiers behave like real men, and because weapons aren't 100% accurate, combat tends to develop its own narrative. Charging across a field in MG fire shouldn't work, but sometimes it does. One man shouldn't be able to fight off a full enemy squad, but sometimes that's what happens. Exploits in RTS games usually center around what the player has done. Exploits in close combat are much more dynamic, oddly enough taking on that all things are possible framework used in later games like The Sims or even Dwarf Fortress. Close combat tries to emulate the fact that combat itself is utterly unpredictable. Clausewitz once stated that everything is simple in war, but the simplest thing is difficult. While you can guide your troops to where they need to be, an accumulation of petty circumstances can derail your master plan. These are little nuances, sure, but they greatly impact how the game is played. Forcing the player to adapt to unforeseen circumstances is what makes close combat a genuinely great game. It's the same reason we watch Texas Hold'em on TV. There's a lot of skill involved, but it's the element of luck that keeps us watching. Creating dynamic gameplay without becoming strictly unfair is what makes close combat enjoyable years past its release. And all of these gameplay mechanics are communicated to the player with the game's excellent presentation. Atomic Games managed to give us Saving Private Ryan before Saving Private Ryan. But unlike Spielberg's hit movie, Close Combat was rated for kids ages 6 and up. Nothing like coming home from learning how to read and write and playing this.
Come tiptoe through the tulips with me. From the garden, from the garden. Through the tulips with me.
So what became of Close Combat anyway? After the success of Close Combat, Atomic Games quickly developed two sequels, both titles adding new kinks to the formula. The first sequel, A Bridge Too Far, focused on the disastrous Operation Market Garden. It introduced strategic level resource management and also gave the player limited time with which to beat most of its maps. Whereas the other games in the series focused on destroying your enemy, A Bridge Too Far focused more on capturing objectives and bettering your strategic position. It is, in my opinion anyways, the best game in the series. A year after A Bridge Too Far, Atomic Games came out with The Russian Front, arguably the biggest game in the entire series. As you can probably infer from the title, the game focused on Germany's ill-fated invasion of Russia beginning in 1941. The game distinguishes itself from the Trilogy by having the best production value by far. There's Russian and German voices, a giant catalog of units to play with, and a very diverse range of scenarios that include some of the biggest battles in all of human history. As far as sheer quantity goes, the Russian Front is a very good game. Sadly, the rest of the industry wasn't that interested in trying to emulate Atomic Games' success. Aside from the brilliant Combat Mission Wargame series, which in many ways took after Close Combat's interface, the strategy genre never really jumped onto Close Combat's coattails. We got better settings, sure, like Homeworld, Age of Mythology, or even the Black and White series, but the genre more or less has refused to step outside its comfort zone. The closest thing we've had to a, quote, spiritual successor was Relic's Company of Heroes, a game that included mechanics like suppression, as well as some randomness when it came to tank battles. Unfortunately, most features from Relic these days have been aimed elsewhere. It is fortunate that, given the almost endless amount of derivative and redundant gameplay, that the RTS genre managed to somehow avoid the swift death that befell the adventure genre. The growth of the RTS's competitive scene probably single-handedly saved the entire genre. Even though the genre stands upon the foundations of a 20-year-old game in Dune 2, there's something exciting about equally skilled players competing, so that's what keeps the genre alive today. But if the industry's treatment of other realistic games is any sign, I doubt we'll ever see a game like Close Combat again. Modern gaming has simply moved on. Unless, wait, someone's telling me that they made an updated 3D version of Close Combat a couple years ago? How did I not hear about this?
Go! Lighter!
Green.
Go!
Contact.
You don't have to bastardize all my favorite games.